Good afternoon and welcome back to Early Modern Europe. We're actually to our final lecture of the term, and it's a whopper. So I would encourage you to go ahead and get all of your provisions, and it's okay to take breaks throughout all of this. But I wanted to try to capture the full sweep of the French Revolution in one sitting. And so even though I'm doing this in one sitting, you don't have to. In fact, I would encourage you to take this in smaller chunks. There is a lot going on. And what's important for us to think about from the very beginning is this. The French Revolution is one of the great conundrums in Western history. It really is. The ideals behind it, the notion that they were going to struggle for the rights of people, common everyday folks, is something unique and important and vital, especially even still today. This notion that we as a human society look out for the rights of everybody and not just the very few people at the top of the socioeconomic ladder. But even then, we start thinking about it. We say, well, that's great, the rights of everybody, but they didn't mean everybody, did they? It's not unlike the American Revolution that happens around this exact same time. The notion that all people are created equal, well, that's not what it says. It says all men are created equal. And even then, they didn't really mean it. But the impulse, the ideal of it, is exceptionally important. And so we have that notion of this thing that nobody had really done before, which is guarantee rights for people, regardless of class, generally speaking. But at the same time, the way in which they got there was profoundly gruesome, bloody, even, especially actually. And we have to ask ourselves, was it worth it? Now, most people would look back and say, well, absolutely, because this is going to liberate massive chunks of the human population. That is an inalterably good thing. Right. But was there a better way of doing it? So these are questions I want you to think about as we are wrestling with the minutia of the story, dealing with the various characters and all of the rest that's going on. I want you to think about what it means to give people rights or to acknowledge their rights. These are all growing out of the Enlightenment project, out of the philosophes, and their ideas that from John Locke and others, that there is something inherent about the rights that we have. Not that they are God-given, but that if we are going to make this thing called human civilization and human society work in a way that makes sense for everybody, then we've got to see each other in ways that were absolutely unique. But that you can see the thread that was started to be stitched into the tapestry of the human community, going at least as far back as Marsilius de Padua and other medieval thinkers who started to see us, individuals, and who we are as parts of a society and parts of this thing we call civilization. And so I want you to think about that. I want you to think about our rights our rights as individual human beings and our rights and then responsibilities to the community. Because, as Aristotle says, we are social animals. We live in community, which means we've got to figure out how to make those communities work. And the issue is that for a long period of time, and in most occasions, that idea of making that community work is to make it work for the people who are in charge, the people who have the power, the people who control what's going on. And as long as they're free, they were good. And generally speaking, as long as people's basic needs are met, there's food on the table, and there's generally, it's safe to go out during the day, most people won't mind. That's pure Machiavelli. That if their honor or their livelihood is not endangered, then they don't really care what kind of governance they live under. But the more we thought about it, the more we think about it, the more we wrestle with this, the more we say, well, that's great if you're in the top 1%. What about the rest of us? And that really has been one of the questions that has been bubbling up throughout this entire class. What about the rest of us? How do we fit into this broader society? We're not just the unwashed masses. And so the question is, what rights do we all have? And how does the revolution fit into that? And we see that this revolutionary fervor comes around at a time when people have been really thinking about that, really exploring that, really poking at that in other areas other than politics, but now, of course, it seeps in. And as we talked about last time, there's ample reason to see how it emerges first, or at least most explosively, in France. Right? We can see it. We understand it. It makes sense. And so what we need to do today is we need to unpack this whole thing called the French Revolution. And as you can see, there are 4 phases to the revolution. The moderate phase from 1789 to 1792. This is when you can no longer ignore the problems in France. And we'll talk about those in just a second. And okay, that's great. How do we deal with them? And remember, a lot of these people that are involved in this, they're idealists. They want to do this in ways that doesn't automatically descend into bloodshed. Moderate phase, and then the radical phase, when, shockingly enough, no bloodshed didn't seem to really do the trick. Because it's not surprising that this is going to enter into a radical phase simply for the fact that, well, monarchies are tough to get rid of. They've been around for a very long time. I mean, a long time. Monarchy has been, give or take, the de facto government of choice throughout most of human history. It's only really since the 19th century that this whole notion of republican forms of government have really emerged as a significant thing. Yeah, the United States, late, 18th century, but make no mistake, even our republic wasn't really secure until later. And so it's a new concept. And so getting rid of a king, it's a big deal. And getting rid of the monarchy and the whole supporting structure of it that's a tough nut to crack. Make no mistake about it. All right. So that's 1792 to 1794. The Directory from 1794 to 1799. Can't quite see that around my microphone, but that's what it is, 1794 to 1799. The Directory was the first major crack at establishing a form of governance that was republican in nature, small r. Right? And then Napoleon. 1799 to 1815. We're not going to get all the way to 1815, because frankly, once Napoleon is made emperor, it's kind of tough to talk about anything beyond that without really focusing just on Napoleon. So here we have it, this grand ideal notion that they're going to usher in the rights of people as the driving force for this revolution, and they're going to go from a king to an emperor. And you've got to ask yourself, how successful was that revolution there, people of France? And I want you to think about that too. So think about the big questions of how successful this revolution was. Think about the ideas that they plant. And that's really important. And think about what the implications are for us today as we continue to work through another political transition in the United States. And the way we look at the rest of the world and how they govern themselves. We have a tendency to look through the lens that the French and the American revolutions were the best thing in the world to ever happen. And ultimately, I would agree with you. But how we got there and how they got through it, not the best ways. And of course, remember too, their sense of who they were talking about was far more limited than ours. That's really important. So, with all of these ideas and questions swirling in our heads, and as we settle ourselves in, make sure you have something to drink and probably a snack and maybe a pillow for when this lecture gets a little bit long. Let's settle into this story. And it's a fascinating one. There's no mistake about it. I'm not sure if it's musical level, but they've done that. All right. Before we dive into the details, I want to very briefly talk about some short-term causes. We left off last time with looking at some long-term causes. And so we're going to pick up the ball right where I left it off, with some short-term causes. And one of the interesting things about what's going on is that for as big and as bold and as all the rest as Louis XIV had made the monarchy in France, no matter how much power he consolidated to himself, no matter how much he was essentially trying to push the rest of the aristocracy away, or at least to minimize their influence, his successors were not quite as gifted as he was, as politician, as charismatic as a person, and all of the rest. And he did, in fact, saddle all of his successors with a staggering amount of debt through his massive building programs and his lavish lifestyle, through all of the wars that he got France into. The French economy was definitely teetering on the edge of catastrophe when our story begins in the 1780s. And because of that, that's going to have ripple effects into everything that's going on. And because the new king, Louis XVI, was not as good of a politician and wasn't as smart when it came to policy, right? Because politics and policy are two different things. Politics is how you get stuff done. Policy is what you want to do, right? And those are two different things. And it's really important for us to wrap our heads around the fact that policy and politics aren't the same. Some people are really good at politics, right? And just really lousy at policy. Some people are really good at policy and just terrible at the politics. Some are bad at both. And every now and then you get somebody who's pretty good at both. But shockingly enough, that wasn't any of the recent French kings, even the Sun King Louis XIV. He was great at politics, he was pretty iffy at policy, right? So what you have is an economic catastrophe just waiting to happen. It's a rippling effect out into the rest of French society, not the least of which, because their economy is in such dire straits, they have what we would call runaway inflation, meaning that the value of their currency, right, is just not as strong, which means you need more of that currency to buy simple things. You need more money for the same value. That's inflation, right? The value, so if I go, and this is a thing that we actually saw in France right before the revolution, you want to go buy a loaf of bread. It's going to cost you a few months' wages due to inflation. How many peasants are going to be able to afford that? They can't. Which is one of the immediate causes of the French Revolution, is that simply there's not enough food. People are starving to death. And shockingly enough, one of the things that people expect a government to be able to do is to help them put food on the table in a way that doesn't break the bank. The fastest way to revolution is to start starving your people, because they're going to assume that this is something that you should be able to do. Now, the interesting thing, of course, is that food shortages never touch the aristocracy, never touch the monarchy, because they always have enough resources to buy whatever they need at whatever the cost. And they get the best stuff, right? There's a reason why people get really upset that right now there are a lot of people standing in food lines. There's a reason why we remember the depictions of the Great Depression of people standing in food lines, waiting for soup or food. And we always say, oh yeah, the economy was terrible at that time. Have you seen the pictures? Have you seen the videos of cars upon cars upon cars stretching for a long time, waiting in line for boxes of food? That is the sign of a deeply problematic economy. And that's what was going on in France. And the king didn't seem to really care because it didn't affect him. And because he had a tendency to look at all of those people, all of those masses of people, as not people, right? So this is a problem. This economic reality, the food shortages, the inflation, all of it. Now, on top of that, what you're also going to see is that those regional political courts, the Parlement, right? There's 13 of them at this time. They're trying to regain their political strength. They weren't particularly thrilled with the fact that Louis XIV was able to sideline them so effectively. People don't like being out of power, and they're going to find their way back in whenever they can do it, right? It will come back at some point, and so they're working on it. These people, these regional political courts and all the rest, they're trying to regain political strength. And they see Louis XVI as a golden opportunity because he's not as strong. Any perceived weakness, right? And it also makes sense because they can see that Louis XVI really doesn't care what's going on in the rest of France. That's also one of the long-term lingering hangover problems of focusing everything on Versailles, right? You stop seeing what's going on in the countryside. And so if you get word of it, it's different than when you see it. When you hear that people are suffering, it's different than when you actually see somebody who is hungry. And so he's isolated. He's, insulated from all of that. That's going to be a problem. The other thing is that in France, there's this thing called the bourgeoisie, the middle class. And this is one of my favorite Grant truisms. Revolutions start from the middle class. Revolutions do not start with poor people, right? Because they know they don't have any power. And so they've got the numbers, and they'll have peasant uprisings and rebellions and all the stuff, but they always get crushed because they don't have any military backing. They don't have the education necessary to do the planning and the plotting and all of the rest. There's no structure. There's no ideological basis for their revolution. They don't know what to do once they get there other than they want it better. All right, that's awesome, and God love them, but you're not going to get revolutions from the bottom. Revolutions start from the people who know that they have the ability to do what needs to be done, but don't have the power to do it. And so the bourgeoisie, they're eager to advance their social and political status. And we're going to see this as they try to move the estates general, right? The 3 estates. Well, this is a group that's supposed to meet every now and then. And the aristocrats and the first estate of the higher clergy are like, no, we don't need to meet. We don't need to do this. We don't need to do that. And the bourgeoisie, who are a part of the third estate, right? They don't have titles, so they're not nobility. They're not clergy, so they're out on that too. And so they're always pushed away with the rest of the peasants, the serfs. And with Atlantic trade and all of the rest, some of these people are really starting to make a name for themselves. The middle class is really an emergent thing, and they would like to have more political and economic power and freedom. Thank you very much. And that's where the drive is going to come from. The motivation to overturn everything comes from people who know that there is power that they should have, but can't get it. They know that they should have more economic possibilities, but they can't get there because they are limited by those people on the top. And revolutions happen when the middle class starts paying attention to the true villains of the story. Because the upper class, they know that the oldest game in the book to keep the middle class mollified, or at least focused in the wrong direction, is to say to the middle class, you know who your real problem is? Those poor people. If you can keep those poor people away, if you fight with them, you're going to be better off. It's the let's you and him fight scenario. The upper class, right, the nobility, the aristocracy is dependent upon making sure that the poor people and the middle class fight with each other instead of seeing the fact that their real problem is the upper class, the nobility, the 1%. When the middle class, however you want to describe them, and the lower classes, however you want to describe them, when they stop fighting amongst themselves and aim their ire in the right direction, then you will get change. Then you will get revolution. It's got to come from the middle class. And that, yes, the upper middle class, you name it, whatever. They're not nobility. They're not the aristocracy. They're not the 1%. They have to be engaged. And so one of the things that the bourgeoisie is going to push through the Estates General, the meeting of the 3 groups, which hasn't happened in a long time, but they're making a lot of notion that this is going to, and one of the things that they want to push is taxing the nobility. Think of this. The wealthiest people in France do not get taxed. The church, the nobility, the aristocracy. So the people who hold 90%, 95% of the wealth don't pay taxes. So France's economy is based on the taxation of everybody in the third estate. You see why they might think that that is wildly unfair? Do you see why we have a tendency in the United States to say, yeah, the rich should pay their fair share? Because we've seen what happens when you don't. You run budget deficits, or you run into bankruptcy problems. You simply cannot generate enough income to do just about anything if you exempt the wealthiest people from taxation. In 1787, they were really driving, the bourgeoisie is driving the notion that they need to tax the nobility. And shockingly enough, the nobility's like, we vote not to. Really? Who could have guessed that that was going to happen, that they were going to vote against raising their taxes, or even just instituting taxes, as it were? Is it a surprise right now that we have a tendency to cut taxes on the wealthiest people? Because they have the most voice. They're the ones who, when they speak into the politicians' ears, the politicians listen the most, because they're getting campaign contributions and all the rest. Is this cynical? Sure, but it's the way it's been working. And so the bourgeoisie looks at this and says, we are never going to get a fair shake as long as these people are in charge. There's no way of getting around this. And then, of course, when the famine hits, when it really starts to bite, right? The peasants, they look to the Estates General, and the only thing that they figure out is that the aristocracy and the upper clergy are going to grant themselves even greater privileges. And so, starting in 1788 and for the next couple of years, we're going to see actual attacks on the nobility by the peasantry, yes, but increasingly by the bourgeoisie, because they can see the room where it's all happening, to use a more current musical. They know what's going on in the room where it's happening, and they know they're not in it. They're not in that club, and they really want to be. And so here's the thing. The French Revolution probably could have been completely avoided had the nobility decided to give up a little bit of power, not as much as you might think, a little bit of power, and to say, yeah, we'll take on a little bit of taxation. Those two things, which were never going to happen. The rich people will never say, oh yeah, increase my taxes. Maybe a few of them, not most of them, right? Increase my taxes and we'll give up a little bit of power. Shockingly enough, this does not happen without grave threats. But what is happening, and what you can see, is that Louis XVI, King Louis XVI, is now finally getting a clue as to the reality of what's going on out there. The peasants are starving, and they're righteously angry. The bourgeoisie, who is now starting to be able to throw some weight around, culturally, socially, right? Even artistically, you see people like Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, who writes The Marriage of Figaro, right? It's a great musical, right? Opera is what we would call it nowadays. And in it, he's making fun of the aristocracy, the nobility. And at first, everybody's like, oh, some of his big time backers were like, you can't say things like that. One of them, which was the King of Austria. And he's like, yeah, really, I can. And it scared people. It scared people a lot, at least in the nobility. And so you could see the culture was changing. Things were moving. Amazing stuff. And so King Louis XVI says, okay, I'll call into session the Estates General. The Estates General essentially was the there we go. Had to get my board in plain view. The Estates General were the three groups. The first estate, the upper clergy. Second estate, the nobility. Third estate, everybody else. Well, the Estate General, they have representatives from each of these estates, and they're going to have to vote or be brought together to talk about all of these issues. It's too much for a weak king to just be able to say, ha, by monarchical fiat, this is the way it's going to be. And so they bring this legislative body that hasn't met in a couple hundred years by this point back into session. And this is really the beginning of the revolution itself, when the Estates General begin to meet. The first thing they were going to argue about is how are we going to vote on things? Each of the estates generally had been in the past, each of the estates gets one vote. And you think, wait a minute, if you've got the upper clergy, right, the nobility, and everybody else is always going to get outvoted by the other two, because there's no way that those two are ever going to vote for right. There's your problem. And so do you do one estate, one vote, or do you do like the representatives from the third estate demanded, and that is that it should be voted by percentage of the population? Is it representative voting or not? Now, of course, if it's representative voting, if you're voting by the number of population, the third estate is going to win everything. And what you get is a deadlock, right? What a surprise. They couldn't agree even on how to vote on this stuff, because they knew one way advantaged the first and second estate, the other way advantaged the third estate. They were not going to try to find a compromise. And so it was deadlocked. And the king's like, oh, I don't know what to do. Right, that's a shame. That's terrible. We can't decide on anything. Maybe I'll just go and decide myself. And they're like, no. No, thank you very much. And so what we get is called the Tennis Court Oath. And you're like, what are you talking about? Remember, they're meeting at Versailles. The third estate decides to leave the assembly area. And they create what is called the National Assembly, a new legislative body. So the third estate declares itself the National Assembly, and from that point on, they will make the decisions about what's going to happen. Louis XVI responds by locking the third estate out of the meeting hall. Oh, sorry, if you're not in the meeting, you can't actually do anything. The third estate, still on Versailles, relocates to the nearby tennis courts, where its members vow to stay together and to create a written constitution for France. And they write a constitution on the tennis courts. The tennis court oath is in many ways the beginning of the moderate phase, because essentially what they're doing is saying, you're not going to listen, you really don't want us around, so we're just going to create this new national legislative body. And Louis sees the way this is going, and he's like, oh, that's not good. Why is this not good? Well, very simply, they were going to be able to get the popular will swung around in behind him. And then all of a sudden, Louis is going to be outnumbered in his own country by about 25 million to a couple 100,000. The middle class was staging its revolution. They were hitting where it hurt politically. And they weren't just disappearing. They weren't shrinking away. And Louis didn't have the power just to crush this rebellion, because in order to do that, well, he was going to need a heck of a lot more help. Help that wasn't coming. Because the ideas, think of it, this is 1789, yeah? The American Revolution is a done deal by this point, just about. They've been helping out the Americans against the British. And those ideas of self-governance, no monarchs, that's been filtering around for quite some time, and even farther back with the philosophes, and all of the ideals of Locke and others, Rousseau and all the rest of the Enlightenment. Those ideas are really impossible to kill. Once they are out there, once they are flourishing, what are you going to do? And so on June 23rd, 1789, Louis XVI relents. He orders the three estates to come back together to meet as the National Assembly, he keeps the name, and to vote by population, right, on a constitution for France. He gives them the Constitution. Now, he didn't want one. The last thing that he wanted was for them to sit down and write out a whole bunch of lovely ideals and laws and a way in which a government was going to be formed. Oh my goodness, that's the last thing that he wanted to do. But he wanted to say it out loud. Oh yeah, let's go write a constitution. And then he whistles up his military. And the idea was, well, what we'll do is a swift military action against the National Assembly while they're still on the territory. How much of this had actually become real planning and how much of it was just aspirational is hard to know. But word got out. The rumor mill began. And by July of 1789, the people of Paris thought that this is definitely a real thing. And on July 14th, 1789, people stormed the Bastille. The Bastille was a prison, right, for political prisoners. And on July 14th, we get the storming of the Bastille. They release the political prisoners and they seize weapons. And the Parisians, right, the citizens of the largest city in France at the time, and not just a bunch of peasant farmers out in the rural areas, which is what, frankly, before, monarchs had always been able to put down those kind of rebellions. But now they have this massive urban population to deal with. And it's a collection of the urban poor all the way up to the bourgeoisie. So the Parisians organized their own government, which they called the commune. They went out of their way to attack nobles. They destroyed the records of feudal dues and taxes owed, which is an interesting thing. They didn't have computer backups. If you destroy the records, it's over. There are no feudal relationships if you don't have the written records. If you don't have written records of taxes, you don't pay taxes because there's no record. You don't know whatever, there's no backups anywhere. You destroy all the records, and congratulations, you've essentially just thrown your economy into a blender. It's amazing, especially getting rid of the feudal dues. Oh, I don't know. You have no relationship with me there, pal. You know? Can you prove it? Oh, you can't. That's a shame. That's too bad. I love to fulfill my responsibilities as, somebody who belongs to this particular, demesne. But, it's what it is. No proof, not worrying about it. They knew what they were doing. They knew that by getting rid of the written record, right, they were essentially erasing all of those legal contracts, which is what feudal, or if you want to say manorial dues and all the rest actually were. It's just a relationship in contract form between somebody who works the land and somebody who owns the land. Oh, I'm sorry, that contract is gone, therefore it doesn't exist. Right? If all you have are written records, if you get rid of the written records, don't you like how this works? And so you've set up, this is all happening. And this is why France is teetering on the brink. A lot of the nobles look around and are like, you know what? Oh, look, it's time to go. And they flee France. They can read this very well. They don't need somebody saying, you know what? It looks like they may be coming for the nobility next. They're already coming for the nobility. It's time to get the heck out. And so many of them just leave. It becomes so tense that Louis XVI even is forced to fly the flag of the National Assembly, the tricolored flag. Yeah, the one that they still fly, that's the French Revolution flag. And because of what's happening in 1789, now, interestingly enough, the Parisian Commune is going to fear that Louis XVI is going to figure out how to quell this uprising, this, essentially, paroxysm of violence and score settling. Because one of the things that they're always afraid of is the fact that all aristocracy in Europe is interrelated. Right? Louis XVI's wife, Marie Antoinette, she's Austrian, right? She's the sister of the Austrian emperor, for heaven's sakes. Her devotion was never really to France. Her devotion is to the nobility. And so they never trusted the monarchs not to bring in outside forces, outside troops. And that's exactly what Louis XVI was planning. The best thing to do is if you don't have enough Frenchmen to fight for you, you bring in the Austrians and others to do it on your behalf. Yeah, I mean, things are getting dodgy really fast, and the Parisians understood that they may not be facing only French troops who were loyal to the monarchy, because there are some of those. There are royalists, right? In every fight with a monarch, you're going to have people who are going to be the dead enders of the 1% who are going to cling on to power. They've attached themselves like lampreys to the people who have the power and the wealth, and they're going to stick with that. That's what got them there. But not everybody. And so they're like, oh, great, Louis and his Austrian wife, Marie Antoinette, they are not going to be fighting on our side, and they're going to bring in foreign troops to put this thing down. And so Paris continues its rebellion against the king. It's so much so, right? Then October 5th, 1789. So, right, this is still all 1789. Just a few months after the storming of the Bastille, a group of women from Paris go out to Versailles and attack Versailles, right? That monumental palace. There's a bunch of Parisian women out there attacking, which is kind of awesome if you think about it. It was so bad that the royal family was forced to relocate into one of their more secure compounds in downtown Paris. Right? The Tuileries Palace, where for the next couple of years, the French royal family is essentially going to become prisoners. I mean, they're not officially prisoners, but they can't go anywhere else. You step outside that castle, you step outside that palace, and the people of Paris are going to tear you apart. That's how dodgy it's gotten. And Louis realizes the only thing that he can really do is to say to the National Assembly, well, you guys better get to work. And so that's what happens. The National Assembly is going to start working on a constitution and a form of governance and a declaration about this whole thing. And by 1791, they've got it. They've got a document. It's going to abolish the guilds and the labor unions that essentially acted not as a way of supporting the working people, but as a way of supporting those who controlled the working people. They're going to abolish all special privileges for the nobility. And they are going to declare the rights and the equality of all people before the law. And they're going to do it in the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen. And this is, and make no mistake about it, a stunning document filled with the Enlightenment ideal that rights are natural to who we are as people who live in community and society. And so they're going to tick them off. Freedom of religion. Whatever religion. Now, again, were they thinking about Judaism and Islam and things like that? Probably not as much, right? There's still a significant strain of anti-Semitism in France at the time, right? That's always been a problem in Europe, and make no mistake about it. The anti-Muslim strain was not as strong, but then again, there weren't as many Muslims yet. But they were really talking about the freedom of religion, meaning Protestants. France was still a Catholic country, even though it had a significant Protestant Calvinist population, the Huguenots. Some Lutherans, but not as many, because frankly, that was just terrain that they had taken over from the Low Countries and into parts of Germany along the rivers. But this was really about saying to the Calvinists, yeah, freedom of religion, freedom of speech. You want to criticize the nobility? That's acceptable. Freedom of the press. It's an interesting thing looking at one of those issues in French society before the Revolution and during the Revolution was the importance of the press. By this point, a larger percentage of the population was literate. They just were. And what this meant is that a lot of people, that's how they got their information. That's how they got their news. Well, if you control the press, what the press says, how they say it, and who it's delivered to, you can control the message and you can control the story. And that's why it's really important that the press remain free, even when they print things that you do not like. In fact, it's never more important than at that point. And so here's the Declaration of Rights of Man and the Citizen and freedom of speech, freedom of the press, guaranteed property rights, that the nobility can't just come in and say, oh, no, sorry, that doesn't belong to you. The three ideals, liberty, equality, fraternity, right? And that last one, right? Liberty and equality, we can sort that one out. Fraternity, brotherhood. And the idea behind that is this notion that we are all connected, that there's no one group that is not, that we rise or fall together, that there is a community aspect to our freedom that must be understood, that this is not simply the triumphal reality of the individual opposed to the community, but that the community itself recognizes the freedom of and the rights and the responsibilities. There's an interesting thing there, right? It's really important for us, especially in the modern world where we have a tendency to wildly over celebrate individualism, especially in the United States. Libertarianism, right, is contrary to our understanding that we are political creatures. Libertarianism is radical individualism, and it works contrary to good governance and the development of healthy societies, because we've got to see each other not only for what we can give, but what we need, right? It's rights and responsibilities. A couple of the other things that they talk about: the right of the people to create laws, a legislature, right? The most powerful branch of any government needs to be its legislature, not its executive branch, not the judiciary. The writing of laws, the crafting of laws, legislation. John Locke talks about that, right? And when he's talking about the kinds of government that we should be developing, the notion is that the power is situated at most in the legislature. Why? It's the most representative of the people. I don't care if you call it a king or a president or anything else like that. You cannot note the will and locate the will of the people in one person or in an exclusive group of, say, judges, like the Supreme Court. In the American Constitution, It's the legislature that has the most power. They just don't always use it, which baffles me. They cede that power to other places. If I'm in the legislature, I would want to spend all my time and spend all of my political capital wrestling back authority that we have given to the judiciary and the executive branch. And I don't care who president is at the time, the legislature is where the seat of our authority should be, because it's the most representative. And they understood that. The right of the people to create laws, not the aristocracy, not the nobility, and also a right to a fair trial, a jury, with all the attendant issues of the presumption of innocence, the need to produce verifiable evidence, the recognition that hearsay and all of the other conspiratorial nonsense is not admissible in court if you cannot prove it. And you need to prove somebody's guilt. They don't have to prove their innocence. The protections are on the side of the individual. The burden of proof is on the state or whoever it is who's prosecuting the case. Right? That's a fair trial. And we have those distinctions, right? You want to get evidence, you get it the right way. There's no coercion involved, and all of the rest. So this is a statement of the rights of who we are as people and as citizens. And it's got to be both. And our rights, right? We have the rights. These are not simply political rights, they're human rights. Because we have political rights and we have economic rights and we have social rights. And so what we're really talking about here are human rights. Now, their understanding of who a human being is far too limited, because they weren't talking about women and they weren't talking about people who had been enslaved. Not yet. They'll get there, but very slowly. They didn't even mean people who didn't own property, which was a real problem. All right, so the Constitution of 1791 is going to build on this, and there's going to be a number of democratic features. France is going to become a limited monarchy. It's going to look a lot like England, with a parliament and a king. The king will become the head of the state. Laws will be written by the legislative assembly. See, that makes perfect sense. You get to have your cake and eat it too. You get to have a king, and that king doesn't really get to tinker with the law, which is awesome. That's a great way of doing it. The notion of these in perpetuity contracts between the person who works the land and the person who owns the land are abolished. You want to enter into an agreement, into a contract that is actually a contract and not just essentially leverage over the poor person? Fine, that's one thing. But you cannot do it in such a way that it so disadvantages that person that they will get no benefit out of it other than their existence, which isn't sufficient. It's not a purely democratic document, though. There's some undemocratic features. Voting was limited to only taxpayers. Well, what about those people who didn't make enough money to actually pay taxes? Offices were reserved for property owners. So all those people who did not own property, they're never going to be able to hold political office. Do you see the problem with that? You can see that. That's not that complicated. If you don't have everybody represented, then you don't have a representative government. And if you say, we have a representative government, really? Do you? Do you mean that? It's like in the United States for a longest period of time, the only people who sat in political office were white men. Is that representative of our country? Not even close. Especially considering, and this is a newsflash, men are only 50% of the population. And white men, a smaller percentage than that. Shrinking every year, by the way. So no, you don't have a representative government if you only have political offices for those who own property at that time. This new government is going to become known as the Legislative Assembly, right? And it puts it right there, Legislative Assembly, which helpfully describes who the assembly of all these people, and they're going to write laws. Now, once the Legislative Assembly is seated, the royal family has got some real concerns. I mean, real concerns. They're now officially freaking out because what do you do in this situation? You are vastly outnumbered. Not everybody in the military has been particularly loyal because they realize what's going on. And so they start to look for some help. And they start to look for some help from Austria. Not that Austria is going to send troops, but that Austria will find some way to help them in other ways, and one of those might be a soft landing. What do you mean? Well, fascinating little story. In June of 1791, the royal family decides that they're going to get out of France. They're going to pack up and leave. You say, but Dr. Grant, they're kind of stuck in the Tuileries Palace. They can't get out of Paris. Well, no, if they look like they normally look like, right? A wealthy family, the wealthiest family, with all of the trappings. And so their grand idea is to dress up as bourgeoisie. Now, here's an interesting thing. A lot of countries in the early modern period had what were called sumptuary laws, so that just by looking at the way somebody was dressed, you could figure out their class. So if you were in the lower classes, you could only wear more drab colors, the roughest of fabrics, all that kind of stuff. The farther you go up the economic food chain, the nicer the stuff you have, right? You move from clasps to buttons, and then the kind of material those buttons are made out of. And so by the time you get up to the king and queen of France, they can dress in the nicest stuff. And so just by looking at somebody, just looking at the way they dress, you can figure out where they are in the socioeconomic hierarchy, right? And they did this throughout. As college students, you would all be wearing your academic robes pretty much all the time. They did this in actually the Harry Potter movies really quite effectively, until they didn't somehow. But you would wear those so that people would know that you're college students, because college students throughout most of the history of universities, going all the way back to the University of Bologna, first university in Europe in 1088, right? College students generally were delinquents, degenerates, drunks, a pain. There's a reason why every campus has university police. The police were there not to keep the townspeople away from the university, but to keep the university students from screwing up the town, right? I love this. This is always one of those little things. So if you just looked at somebody, you would know what kind of person they were. See? If we were in the classroom right now, I'd actually be in my full doctoral robes with my fun 8-sided hat. It would be awesome, I guess. So the king and queen of France and the whole royal family would normally be impossible to miss because of the way they dressed. right? Even when they went out hunting and all those other kinds of things, they still dressed better than anybody else. Even their hunting gear was, just top notch kind of thing. They got it in their heads that they were going to dress as the bourgeoisie, so they dressed down rather radically, right? They even had backstories for each one of them, all this kind of stuff. It was just spectacular. But of course, they're royal, and so they're not going to want to just leave with nothing, and so it takes them a while to get out, right? And they finally do. They finally get out of Paris, and they head out of town. They've got a few carts full of stuff, and, they're on their way, carriages and the whole 9 yards. But it looks like, generally speaking, a bourgeois family who is heading out of Paris and then heading out of France. And they were doing okay until one of the carriages broke down and they had to fix it. And one of the people who fixed it, Marie Antoinette, decided to give that person as a gracious heirloom of her, gratitude for fixing their carriage, this wonderful silver bowl or something like that. And everybody who saw it is like, wow, that's worth more than what I'm going to make in 5 years. And for her, it was just a trinket that she kind of gave away. But that was a problem because people are like, that looks really familiar. It was probably something from the royal household. But even that wasn't a big enough problem. They stopped at a little inn on the river before crossing over. And Louis the 16th was definitely very fond of fine dining, of eating, right? He was a gourmand, right? And so he decided that they would like to have a meal in France before they leave, because he remembered this little inn and, it was just spectacular. And so he decided to stay there. Now, the story goes, and there's no actual evidence that this actually happened in this way, but I choose to believe it simply because it makes perfect sense. The dinner lasted 5 hours. Multiple courses, lots of wine, you name it, because this is the way Louis ate almost every day, right? This is what he did. And they were all sitting there and having a grand old time, and by the time they got out to their carriages, well, a crowd had gathered. They had heard that the King and Queen of France were in town. And they're thinking, well, that seems really strange. Where are you guys going? Why are you packed for a very long journey? And why are you headed towards the border? And then everyone's like, I know what's going to happen. You're trying to get out of town, aren't you? You're trying to flee. And look, there's Austrian soldiers on the other side of the river waiting to help you. Are you selling us out? Yes, they were trying to do it as quickly, but they didn't do it quickly. Only the French would stop for a 5-hour meal as you're escaping the country. It's amazing. Shockingly enough, they were nabbed by the local gendarmes, the local police, and marched back to Paris. And then they were put under house arrest. Like, you guys were trying to bugger off. You were going to go sell us out to the Austrians because you have more in common with the nobility over there because of Marie Antoinette and the rest of the nobles, right, than you do with the French. They were not happy in the slightest with all of this. And they weren't the only one. There were other nobles who fled the revolution, and they hoped that if they could go and cozy in with the other aristocracy, that they could somehow regain enough power to put the old regime back into control. So the king's family tries to book it, fail miserably. This is why you should never stop on the border for a 5-hour meal when you're escaping the country, right? And they're not the only ones. There are other nobles trying to get out of town, trying to find ways to bolster support once they're out. You have the church. The church officials are screaming about everything. They want their church land rights back. They want the privileges restored. They're like, wait a minute, you actually expect us to go home and do our jobs? Because so many of the upper clergy had been soaking up the luxuries at Versailles like the rest of the nobility. And all of a sudden they're saying, wait a minute, wait, what? And out of all of this, frustration is going to grow spectacular, and we're going to see the emergence of a couple of political parties in the revolutionaries. And the political parties, the first are the Girondists. These are members of the Gironde, right? Essentially, they're government officials from the region of Gironde. That's simple, Girondists, right? They're moderates, right? They're already government officials. They're not aristocracy, they're not nobility, they're not in the upper clergy, they're members of the third estate, but make no mistake about it, these guys were middle class to upper middle class people in positions of government. They represent the rich middle class of the provinces, the people outside of Paris. Not really so much an organized political party, but they're essentially a driving force of the revolutionary ideals and the legislative agenda and the writing of the Declaration. These are the earliest movers and shakers. And they were originally a part of the Jacobins, right? A club, essentially. The club, the Jacobin Club, right, were these people who essentially were revolutionaries. And the Girondists, these moderate, representing the rich or the upper middle class and the rich middle class, they were a part of this Jacobin Club until, well, later when a guy named Maximilien Robespierre essentially ran all of them out because they were too moderate, right? They wanted to overturn the established order. They didn't want to burn it down. So the other group are the Jacobins. These are members of the Jacobin Club, the Friends of Freedom and Equality, founded by a bunch of anti-royalists in 1789, originally the Girondists. The Jacobins, though, represented the workers, the people that were called the sans-culottes, right? The people who worked for a living. They were far more revolutionary. They're decidedly more reactionary, and they were incredibly violent. This is when the revolution turns into something much different. And this is what we call the radical phase. On September 22nd, 1792, the convention is going to meet for the first time. And this convention, this group, right, of Girondists and Jacobins, are going to establish the first French Republic. Now, from the very beginning, this is going to be a really tenuous arrangement between the Girondists and the Jacobins, because those two groups could not agree on how to move forward, because the Girondists were moderates, the Jacobins were radicals, It was a question of how far do you push and how far do you want to go? How far do you need to go? Right? And that's the fight in many ways in politics. It's between conservatives on one side and small c, which means to conserve what is there, regardless of what that is. So you have conservatives, you have moderates, people who are trying to find the difference between staying exactly the same, conservatives, maintaining the status quo, and on the other side, the radicals. The radicals are essentially the group that wants to overturn whatever is going on. And so it's a matter of how much change do you want to engage and push for in your political system. A conservative is going to want none, no change, regardless of what the system is, right? At least that's going to be their argument, although how true that is, it's always an interesting thing. Moderates are going to try to find the path between Scylla and Charybdis so that the fewest number of people get eaten by the monsters of either side. And the radicals look at that and say, well, you know what? The whole thing's got to go because what's happening in the status quo is terrible. And so you're trying to find a way to initiate change in a way that brings about the desired result. And so the National Convention, that's going to be the problem. Who's going to get control of this? Now, the interesting thing is that it's not just an internal domestic opposition that they were going to see for this first French Republic. The first French Republic is also going to face opposition from abroad. Austria, England, Holland, Prussia, Sardinia, Spain, all of these are going to form a coalition against France because France is upsetting the status quo in all of Europe. If a French Revolution is actually successful, what you're going to get is that revolutionary impulse everywhere where there's a monarchy, right? And the English have just dealt with this because they've just lost to the Americans. Oh, and remember, the French helped the Americans, and so the English just want to pay them back. Sometimes I think that's a part of this whole story. The English were less concerned about the French monarch, and they just wanted to kick France in the teeth. After a while, some arguments between countries are they just want to see the other burn. I think sometimes that's where England and France were at that time. The convention is going to move forward, right? They're going to abolish the monarchy. Poof. As long as the royal family lived, they argued, the monarchy could be restored. Which means they're going to put the royal family on trial. The convictions of these cases were a foregone conclusion. Louis XVI was guillotined on January 21st, 1793. And it's from this point on that the guillotine is going to sing a song all for the next couple of years. And it's going to claim a bloody price. When Louis went to the guillotine, he wanted to give a short speech. And he started. And then the drums rolled and nobody could hear him, so they just forced him down into it. And his head was chopped off, and they held it up for the crowd, and the crowd went nuts. They celebrated the death of their king. A little bit different, right? Than the English. A lot of people actually brought up napkins to dab up the blood to take home as souvenirs because they wanted proof that the king was dead. Yeah, they had moved into the radical phase at this point. Later that year, October 16th, 1793, Marie Antoinette was guillotined. She was seen often as the exact problem of a noble family. She was wealthy beyond imagining. She was haughty and pompous and soaked in her luxury. She never said, "Let them eat cake." She didn't say it. Sorry. It was probably somebody else. It shows up in a book by Jean-Jacques Rousseau about some other lesser noble woman. And she said, essentially, let them eat brioche, which is bread. It's nice bread, still bread. She never said, let them eat cake. That was very much a creation of the press at the time. People just assumed she was that terrible. She probably was, right? She was a person who never in her life had a moment of want, and never in her life had a moment of being without power. And she reveled in it. And if she could have gotten out and to Austria, she would have been there in a shot. They tried, remember? The daughter of the king and queen, Marie Therese, was allowed to go to Vienna in 1795. They reasoned that since she couldn't become a queen, they could let her go. Why not? Well, because in France, they had a different rule than in England. In France, they had a part of the Salic law was that females could not succeed to the throne. There are no French queens who have full power. I mean, they're queens, but they're not in charge. Yeah, so much for the enlightened French. The son, Louis Charles, also known later as Louis the 17th, was beaten and imprisoned until he died in 1795. The French did not have the same existential struggle about the killing of their royal family and their king. They celebrated. They were ready. They wanted him gone. The problem is, of course, right? The problem is that once you start the guillotines singing, how do you stop? How do you stop them? So while they were busy doing that, the convention had taken over the military, right? And they were doing a fairly successful job of dealing with the foreign crises. Their military was successful. The French forces were always particularly strong. And after the death of the royal family, the Jacobins really became the major power of the political scene in France, and especially a guy named Georges Danton. Georges Danton and then a guy named Maximilien Robespierre will create with others in the convention the Committee of Public Safety. It was headed by Danton. And it was spectacular in its thoroughness in revolution. They rejected all organized religion, all of it. It all had to go. It was a problem. The church was a luxury they could no longer afford. It was always going to be a crisis, and so best just to get rid of it. They created what they called a civic cult of virtue, that they were going to have virtues, not unlike the ancient Romans. but these were going to be a celebration of Republican virtues, small r, Republican virtues. One of the best ways to think about this is the symbolic reforms that we see, especially of like the calendar. They renamed all of the calendar months. They took away any name that smacked of religion or the monarchy. And so things like August, right, which is for Augustus, gone. All the rest, the ones that are named for the various gods, all of them gone. Like an example is that the month that they're going to have 12 months, and it's going to, their new year is going to start with the autumnal equinox, right? And so it usually happens in the middle of what we would call a month. One example is July into August. That month it was called Thermador. Thermador, from the Greek thermon, right, or thermon, which is summer heat. And so they named all of their months after essentially the weather that they were having at the time. 12 months, every month had 30 days, and there were 3 weeks. And they were just essentially called the first day, the second day, the third day, and then you would wash, rinse, and repeat. New month. Okay, that's some of the harmless stuff, although it was weird, right? And the decimalization of everything in the calendars and mathematics and all the rest. But there were also mass campaigns against dissidents. Anybody who spoke out against the Committee for Public Safety was going to be guillotined. There were people who were accused of treason, and they were tried by the committee's popular tribunal. At least 15,000 people were executed by the Committee of Public Safety and this popular tribunal, including some of the most innovative thinkers who were alive at the time, but who did not agree with Danton and Robespierre. If you were on the wrong side of an argument with them, you were going to get killed. Members of the Girondist party tried to get the Reign of Terror, which is what they call this period. They tried to get the Reign of Terror to be reined in. They tried to get the Jacobins to settle the heck down, that killing your way to revolution, killing your way to a new government, wading through all of this blood, getting rid of anybody who disagrees with you even just a little bit, was clearly not going to create the kind of stable government that you would like to see. And shockingly enough, any opposition by the Girondists to the Committee of Public Safety meant that a lot of Girondists would be tried and executed for treason. Awesome revolution you got there, fellas. This is great. Eventually, even Georges Danton, the guy who started the Committee of Public Safety, started to say, you know what? I think we're probably executing too many people. This may be getting out of hand, which resulted in Danton being tried and executed as a traitor. And this guy, Maximilien Robespierre, takes over. He continues the executions, speeds them up in many ways. This guy is a moralist and somebody who wanted to grip the new French Republic in an iron grip of his own ideals, his own notions. And he believed that the best way to get yourself through this revolution was to kill as many people who disagreed with him as possible. If there is a villain in the French Revolution, it's this guy. And there are a lot of candidates. But Robespierre did nobody anything. A disaster of a human being. And merciless. He was likely the one who got Danton killed. easy. And how many people, how many thinkers we lost because of people like this. The convention, right? The legislative body starts to realize that Robespierre was the problem. Yes, it was. And we start to get what is called the Thermadorian reaction, right? As we move into the next phase. On July 27th, 1794, the Reign of Terror came to an end. They wrote a new constitution. They created this thing called the Directory, which was this new governing body who was going to sit essentially as the chief council of the assembly. And on July 28th, 1794, Maximilien Robespierre, the night after he was either attacked or tried to commit suicide and shattered his jaw with a bullet, they put a paper bandage around his head to keep his jaw essentially from falling off. And they led him to the guillotine and executed him. A criminal of the state. And the Reign of Terror died with him. And we get the next part of our story. Because now we moved into the phase that is known for the group that essentially led it, called the Directory. 1795 to 1799. The Reign of Terror was over. The French military had been more than successful in squashing the foreign invasion of France. That whole network of countries and city-states had been defeated. The convention, with the leadership of the Directory, was finally able to inaugurate its new constitution. And everybody took a big, deep breath. And they said, in the year 3 of the Republic, they created the Directory, and they said, this is how it's going to work. There's going to be an executive branch, 5 directors appointed by the legislature, right? You don't get elected directly by the people. The legislature make that decision. In the legislature, right, the second branch, you get the lower house, 500 members. They propose the laws. So the lower house, what we would call the House of Representatives, right? The biggest number, they propose laws. The upper house, 250 members, voted on those laws. So there's your check and balance. 2/3 of the legislature would initially be filled by members of the convention. So essentially the people who had been fighting the revolution the whole way along. They had hoped by creating the Directory and having a formal constitution for the makeup of the legislature that they could finally move forward. They figured that they had solved their internal crisis, they had solved their external crises. They formally adopted the metric system so that they were essentially in line with everybody else in Europe. They get rid of primogeniture, which the system by which the oldest son inherits all of the father's estate, right? This has the spectacular good news of then dispersing wealth even in the nobility. They drew up a comprehensive system of laws. They ended debt imprisonment. And again, this is a huge and important step. Before this, if you had enough debt and you couldn't pay it back, they just threw you in prison. Not great. Not great for the economy, not great for just about anything. Even more important, they ended slavery in all of France's colonies. And that is important. The Europeans are going to get there first. They're going to realize that what they had started was fundamentally wrong. You can't be running around talking about rights if you enslave people. It's fundamentally contradictory. You can't do it. And so they end slavery in the colonies of France. Now you're thinking, they still are colonialists. Yes, they are, and they will be until the 20th century. And that's going to be a lingering problem that we're still living with. But that's not happening here. But at least, and I mean, this is not a huge high bar, at least they ended slavery in their colonies. It doesn't end the racism that promulgated this, but it's a start. And they got there a heck of a lot earlier than the Americans. They also established a nationwide system of public education. Right? Everybody's going to get educated, at least in some small way. And we often wonder, how does France evolve out of this? Well, education is a huge reason. You want to move your country faster than anything else, educate everybody to the best of your ability. The problem, of course, is that the directory is going to suffer from corruption and poor administration. You're not always going to get good people in charge. And in the beginning, they didn't get good people at all. Well, you had killed off a lot of them, right? The Reign of Terror was, not good for the brain trust of France. A lot of brain drain there, especially if you keep chopping all the smart ones. This is what I've never understood about revolutions, but although I do understand it about revolutions, if you kill all the smart people, if you kill all the educators and the scientists and all that kind of stuff, you have a better shot at controlling the population, but you also have a lot worse chance of actually solving any problems. I've never understood in a million years why governments will get their people worked up against experts. Seems like a bad plan. And so while they're dealing with corruption and poor administration, the people of France, well, guess what? The economy has not been turned around. I mean, great, the king is dead, the royal family is gone, and you've done all this kind of stuff, but it's in those early years, the French economy is still in the sewer. And so the people of France were like, yay, we have a new government. And you look around and like, nothing's changed. This blows. Who's in charge? We're mad at them now. And now the directory, right, and the convention is going to recognize, congratulations, you actually have to be able to run the government. Governance matters. I don't care what your campaign looks like. I don't care what ideals you have. If you cannot do the basic things of running the government, people are going to turn on you, and they have every right to do so. Right? Because they're looking at these guys and they're like, yeah, that's great. You're in charge now. You should actually do something. So it's not just about, for our taxes, we're happy to pay taxes if we get things in return, like safety and security and food on the table and basic infrastructure, right? It's amazing. You can essentially make people pretty content if you just make sure that the basic things are covered. It's why we argue so much about healthcare right now. It's one of the greatest expenditures in a family's budget, and it affects everybody, right? So if you have the ability to make sure that your healthcare is covered, people are going to relax. It's amazing. Who could have thought? Back then, they would just like roads that you can actually get your carts on and food on the table. and an economy that actually is creating employment opportunities. Who knew? But what's interesting about what's going on is that the French people, they believe in France. They become quite nationalistic. They're proud of their country. They're devoted to it. They don't want these people from outside making decisions. They're glad that they were able to take over their country, but now they want them to do their job. And their national pride is also, just absolutely fueled by the fact that the military has done a killer job out there. They have defended France amazingly well, even in the midst of all of this. Which leads to the last bit of all of this. Because the Directory recognizes that they may not have the skills necessary to do this. And so they're going to need somebody who can kind of fit the bill. Somebody who can essentially act as the leader of the nation. You need somebody to focus the national will and the national fervor and the national agenda. And slowly but certainly, they settle on this guy, Napoleon Bonaparte. He's not French. He's Corsican. Corsican by birth. He throws in with France because, well, he grew up to be a military officer. He was an artillery officer. He was an avid reader. I mean, he's brilliant. Really was. Read everything from literature to philosophy to military tactics. And he was a reader of Voltaire and Rousseau. And so kind of got this notion that political change was important. Because he comes from essentially a lower class, part of the nobility. You can't get into the military without that. But he really didn't. I mean, his parents had nothing to speak of, really. And so he believed that political change was necessary. But he was a career military officer, and he didn't see the need for any kind of radical social reform, right? He was a moderate in many ways. He joins the Jacobin Club in 1791 after he was made a military or an artillery officer. At the age of 24 years old, in 1793, at the age of 24, he was made a brigadier general for his actions at the Battle of Toulon. He was a brilliant military strategist and tactician. Make no mistake about it, the man knew his way around a battlefield, except for some catastrophic problems later on in his career. He was brilliant. Not when it came to the Navy, though. He was an army man. He was an artillery guy, right? That he understood. The Navy flummoxed him to no end, and that's usually when he got beat, or when he decided to invade Russia during winter. There's a piece of advice for all of you wannabe military conquest kind of people. Do not invade Russia with land forces during winter. Never works. There. That's the important thing that you've learned from this semester. Do not invade Russia in the winter. Glad I could be of help. So glad that, that really important piece of information. Of course, that was one of his downfalls. But he was brilliant. He was problematic early on, though, because he had fairly close ties to Robespierre, because Robespierre had power and Napoleon attached himself to people with power. He was arrested on charges of conspiracy and treason, but freed because he was still a valuable military officer and people still remembered his valor on the battlefield. In 1795, Napoleon rallies the forces of the National Convention and the Republic against a rebellion of those who would wish to reestablish the monarchy. And so there he is. He's working for the revolution, trying to beat back the powers of a resurgent monarchy. And for that, he was appointed commander-in-chief of the army in 1796. And he was successful, right? Militarily, I mean, he prosecuted the war against Austria and Sardinia. He was able to get armistice signed with Parma and Modena and even Pope Pius VI, right? I mean, this guy was successful. He sets up a republican regime in Lombard. He took the city-states or the republics of Rivoli and Mantua. He even marched on Vienna, which prompted the Austrians to finally sue for an armistice, peace. But the time was all was said and done. Napoleon had won the war in Europe for the French. Well, yeah, so the French citizens are thrilled because they're kicking everybody all over Europe. And it's Napoleon who is the one leading all of these forces. He is brilliant on the battlefield. And what's fascinating is that people always seem to assume that if you're brilliant on the battlefield, that's going to translate into being brilliant at politics. That's not always the case. Those are two different kinds of strategies and tactics. You can't really translate the battlefield into the halls of legislature. But as a brilliant military mind, people listened to him. And so in 1798, he argued that the best way to strike back against the British, who had been a right pain in the posterior, right? The best way to get back at the British was to occupy Egypt. And if you want to get into the military side of this, it's fascinating, but it's long. There's a lot to engage. But there he goes. He goes off to Egypt, which is an interesting thing because while he's in Egypt, they're going to find the Rosetta Stone while he's working with the French scientists. So congratulations, Napoleon. Him deciding to go to Egypt gets us the Rosetta Stone. No, I'm not giving him credit for that. He just happened to put people in the right place at the right time. And so the directorate said, yeah, definitely go to Egypt, because frankly, the 5 people on the directorate were getting a little nervous about his popularity back home, both politically and through the people. He was a young general who was far too successful as far as they were concerned. And so they decided to get him out of town as far as they could. But there were people back in the National Assembly, right? The Legislative Assembly who were like, oh, we want to keep an eye on that guy. He could be the kind of person that could unite France. So while he's down in Egypt, he suffers a catastrophic loss. Admiral Horatio Nelson of England just absolutely trounces the French fleet at the Battle of the Nile, which comes as a surprise to no one because Napoleon was terrible in naval battles. You should never let that man near a boat. Just one of those things. It's one of the most little pet peeves of mine of military strategies. Like, how could you allow, I mean, I know Napoleon was brilliant on everything else, but brilliant on land does not equate to brilliant at sea, and he wasn't, and Admiral Nelson kicked him all over the place. And confined now to land, Napoleon set about to reorganizing the Egyptian government, which, again, not a bad idea, but it absolutely annoyed Turkey, who was the Egyptian protectorate at the time. They react badly. This triggers a new conflict with all the European powers because now they see that France is vulnerable with Napoleon gadding about down in Egypt. And you think, I'm not understanding the foreign policy part of this. It's really not that complicated, right? Under Napoleon's guidance, the French army had essentially pushed back all of the other monarchies who were trying to regain France and maybe take France off the board altogether. right? Just absorb bits and pieces of them. The Directorate, panicky because Napoleon was so talented, packs him off to Egypt. He annoys enough people in Egypt, they're like, oh, that's great. He's way down there. Let's take advantage of the situation and take France, which is a problem. Because now you've got all the military, or you've got all of these foreign wars prompting all sorts of new rounds of purges within the government. The moderates are all going to get kicked out again, any of them that were still alive. The Jacobins are saying, see, we weren't hardcore enough, we didn't kill enough people, it's time to bring some control to all of this. And one of the new directors, one of the new people sitting on the Directorate, a guy named Emmanuel Sayes, realizes that France is in the world of trouble, right? The Jacobins are not helping. Nobody's being able to control any of this. There's no central reality to this whole story. They need somebody who's going to stabilize the situation. And so he reasons that, you know what's going to solve the problem? A military dictatorship. Sayes reaches out to Napoleon to help him stage a coup. And you're thinking, Napoleon's not going to go for that, is he? Of course he is. He's going to save the Republic. By golly. Oh, and yeah, and seize quite a bit of power. But he's going to do it because he's going to save the Republic. On November 9th and 10th, in 1799, Sayes and Napoleon stage their coup. The directors, all the rest of them, are forced to resign, and they create the consulate. There are 3 consuls, right? This should sound like the old Roman Republic. Exactly. That's what they were kind of channeling. Oh, we're going to do this. This is going to be the smartest thing in the world. We're going to put 3 quality people in place, and they're going to be able to settle the whole legislature down, and we're finally going to be able to move forward. So they put Sayes, right, as one of the consuls, a guy named Pierre Roger Ducos, and Napoleon. Napoleon was made one of the consulate, and he was 30 years old. 30. First thing he did was sideline Ducos, right? Congratulations. You have no power, you have no say, you have no authority. And he also recognized that Sayes was a necessary tool for being able to take over fully. Napoleon was an enlightened despot, right? An enlightened autocrat. He was no democrat, that's for certain. He did not believe in the sovereignty of the people. He did not believe in the popular will. He didn't even really believe in parliamentary debate. Parliamentary debate meant essentially saying, yes, Napoleon, that's a swell idea. Let's do this, but let's vote on it to make it look good. The Constitution, new Constitution, was drawn up by Sayes. Doesn't mention rights, doesn't mention liberty, equality, fraternity, but it does maintain the legislative assemblies. But even though they maintained the legislative assemblies, Sayes and Napoleon made sure that they had plenty of power in naming who would sit on those assemblies. And by 1801, Napoleon is the consul of France. And not long after, he is the emperor. And then the emperor in perpetuity. Interestingly enough, in 1804, he promulgates the Napoleonic Code. It's another constitution. But interestingly enough, Napoleon gives permanent form to some of the gains of the revolution itself. Individual liberty, yep. Freedom of work, yep. Freedom of conscience, essentially freedom of religion. The lay character of the state, meaning that the church is stripped out of every position of power in the new republic. There is finally separation of church and state, and Napoleon was the one who codifies that. He also codifies the idea of equality before the law, regardless of station or class. He did protect landed property, though. He gave greater liberty to employers and didn't really care much about employees. He said you could get a divorce, but granted only limited legal rights to women. And he was the Emperor of France from 1804 to 1814. And so in a whirlwind 2 hours, we've gone through the French Revolution. I could literally teach an entire semester on the French Revolution itself. But I have given you at least a taste of it. The ideals of the French Revolution are never fully drowned out, no matter how many people tried to do exactly that. And they did get rid, essentially, of their monarchy. There was a spectacular change in all of this. But we have to ask ourselves, when you start with the king and end with an emperor, how far have you really gone? And how many people had to die to get there? Because you had people like Robespierre and Danton and the Jacobins who, yes, pushed everything forward, and then they pushed it into catastrophe. The economic conditions of the rural and agricultural workers, they were better. But for many of the urban poor, not sure. They did get a more stable economy because it's going to be based on an economy of all people, not just benefiting those at the very top. And that was a spectacular improvement. They did get better regional government out of it. Make no mistake. The parliaments, the parlement, right? They were strengthened. And the idea of equality under the law was enshrined. And that's a huge step. And we began with the idea of rights. Rights for people. Rights inherent to all people. And that's an idea that no matter what they did, you cannot erase. It's going to stay there. And every time they addressed a new constitution, they had to debate it. And the Declaration of Rights of Man and the Citizen is one of those seminal documents declaring the rights of people. And we've used it moving forward as the launching off point for so much of the political reform of the modern world. There's a lot going on, and there's obviously a lot that I did not cover in today's lecture. But it should give you a sense of the ebb and flow of the ideas and the actions, and give you a way to move forward in explorations that get us beyond pop culture and into the messiness of the historical record. I encourage you to dig deeper. Make no mistake about it. I want you to. And I look forward to your questions and your comments in our discussion. But I want to ask, and I want to leave you with this. Was the revolution a success? The only way to really answer that is to figure out what they wanted. And it was clearly something more than just getting rid of the nobility. And it comes around to that notion of rights. And if that's the case, the revolution was a success, because we're still talking about it and still fighting for the notion of those rights. And we keep expanding what we mean by the people. And that's a good thing. Thanks so much for sticking with this long lecture and this fascinating term. It has been an absolute joy to walk through all of these parts of the early modern period with you. And I hope that in some way it's got you thinking about this period of history differently, that it's piqued your curiosity, that it has encouraged you to think about how ideas planted then are still growing today. Because that's really the job of history. Opening doors, asking questions, pushing us all forward, and thinking about these things that have changed our lives, whether we know it or not, and how we're still dealing with these big ideas. Thanks, everybody. I look forward to questions and comments, and I hope to see you in future classes teaching the Reformation era next time, so we'll be diving even deeper into that. But if not, good luck and have fun.